The first notice arrived folded inside a pale government envelope with a red stamp that said Final Review. Most people in Mercer County ignored those letters until someone knocked on the door. But Walter Boone unfolded it carefully beneath the yellow light above his kitchen sink and read every line twice. Outside, February wind dragged dead corn husks across the frozen field behind the farmhouse. The old Boone property sat alone at the end of County Route 14, surrounded by 37 acres of land that used to support 3 generations of cattle and soybeans. Now only 11 acres remained active. The rest had been leased, sold, or quietly swallowed by debt. Walter rubbed a thumb against the paper. Property reassessment hearing, he said softly. His grandson Ethan looked up from the table. That bad? Walter didn't answer immediately. At 72, he had learned that panic usually arrived faster than facts. He folded the letter again with careful precision and slid it beside his coffee mug. It means the bank's pushing. Ethan stared toward the dark window. Everyone in Mercer County knew which bank Walter meant. First National Agricultural Trust had financed nearly half the farms within 50 miles. Their logo hung on grain elevators, scholarship banners, and Little League fences. The town practically breathed through the bank's approval process. 3 months earlier, First National had claimed Walter defaulted on a restructuring agreement connected to a drought relief loan from 2009. Walter insisted the debt had already been resolved years ago. The bank insisted otherwise. And banks usually won. The next morning, Walter drove his rusted Ford pickup into town beneath a gray winter sky. Main Street looked thinner every year. Empty storefronts stood between pawn shops and tax offices. Even the diner where farmers used to gather before sunrise now closed by 2 in the afternoon. But First National Agricultural Trust looked untouched by decline. Tall windows. Fresh brick. Heated sidewalks. Inside, polished marble reflected soft chandelier light across the lobby floor. Walter removed his cap as he approached the front desk. The receptionist smiled with practiced politeness. Appointment? Walter Boone. I'm here about the reassessment hearing. She typed for several seconds before nodding toward the offices upstairs. Mr. Hollis can see you now. Daniel Hollis wore expensive cufflinks shaped like silver wheat stalks. He stood when Walter entered, though the gesture felt more corporate than respectful. Mr. Boone, Hollis said. Please sit. Walter lowered himself carefully into the leather chair. I reviewed your file this morning, Hollis continued. Unfortunately, the numbers are very clear. Walter kept his face still. That's so. The restructuring agreement from 2009 required annual compliance certifications. According to our records, those were never completed. Walter frowned. I handed every paper directly to Sandra Mitchell. Hollis glanced at his computer. Sandra Mitchell retired 12 years ago. She signed them. There's no evidence of that in the archive. Walter leaned back slowly. You're saying I imagined it? I'm saying the bank only recognizes documented compliance. The silence stretched. Behind Hollis, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the town square where Walter's father once sold cattle during autumn auctions. Back then farmers still carried leverage. Land mattered more than paperwork. Now paperwork decided who kept the land. Hollis folded his hands neatly. Mr. Boone, between us, I think it's time to be realistic. Walter said nothing. The remaining debt balance, penalties, and accrued interest placed the property in a vulnerable position. Hollis paused before adding quietly, you may want to consider voluntary liquidation before the hearing. Walter stared at him. Voluntary liquidation. Clean corporate language for surrender. My father built that farm after Korea, Walter said. I understand the emotional attachment. No, Walter replied calmly. You understand numbers. Hollis sighed as if exhausted by rural stubbornness. With respect, Mr. Boone, sentiment doesn't change documentation. According to the records available, you have nothing proving the agreement was satisfied. Nothing. The word hung in the room like smoke. Walter stood slowly, joints stiff from winter cold and decades of labor. You sure about that? Hollis offered the kind of smile bankers practiced in mirrors. If evidence existed, our archive department would have found it already. Walter nodded once and walked out. But something bothered him before he even reached the truck. Sandra Mitchell. He remembered her handwriting clearly because she always looped the letter S too wide. More importantly, Sandra had insisted on making duplicate compliance copies after a filing dispute in 2010 involving another farmer. Walter remembered because she complained about the archive basement flooding every spring. Duplicate copies. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan listened carefully while Walter explained the meeting. "So they're saying the documents vanished?" Ethan asked. Walter removed his coat slowly. "They're saying the documents never existed." "That even legal?" Walter gave a tired shrug. "Legal and true aren't always the same thing." Ethan paced near the kitchen table. At 22, he still believed systems eventually corrected themselves. Walter used to believe that too. Then Ethan stopped walking. "Wait." Walter looked up. "You said archive basement." Walter narrowed his eyes slightly. "Yeah." Ethan grabbed his laptop and opened county property records. "Grandpa, didn't the bank renovate after the flood?" Walter nodded slowly. "Around 2011. Ethan turned the screen toward him. "There was an insurance dispute." "Look." Walter adjusted his glasses. According to county filings, First National Agricultural Trust temporarily transferred document storage during the renovation period to an off-site records contractor 30 miles away. Walter stared at the screen. Temporary transfer. Meaning some files might never have returned to the main archive. For the first time in weeks, something shifted behind his tired expression. Not hope. Hope was dangerous. But uncertainty. And uncertainty meant the bank might not control the entire story. Outside, snow began falling across the dark Boone property while Ethan printed the contractor records. Walter stood near the kitchen window, staring toward the empty fields his father once plowed by hand. Then he spoke quietly. "If they buried something," he said, "they buried it where nobody thought to look." The storage company sat beyond the county line in an industrial strip surrounded by trucking depots and fertilizer warehouses. Its faded sign read Midstate Records Preservation Services, though half the letters had peeled away from the metal frame years earlier. Walter parked beside a loading dock where dirty snow had hardened into gray ice. Ethan climbed out beside him and stared at the building. "This place looks abandoned." Walter shut the truck door. "That usually means nobody asks questions here." Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of steel shelving that disappeared into darkness. Thousands of cardboard archive boxes stretched across the warehouse like a paper graveyard. Dust floated visibly through the stale air. A woman near the front counter lowered her reading glasses as they approached. "Help you?" Walter removed his cap politely. "Looking for archived banking records transferred here around 2011. First National Agricultural Trust." The woman frowned immediately. "We don't release client materials without authorization." "We're not asking to remove anything," Ethan said quickly. "Just verify whether certain files exist." "Same policy." Walter studied her name tag. "Denise Harrow." "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the bank claims records connected to my property disappeared before a foreclosure hearing. If those documents are here, they matter." Denise leaned back in her chair with visible caution. "You got a court order?" "No." "Then I can't help you." Ethan opened his mouth again, but Walter touched his sleeve lightly. Arguing with employees rarely changed outcomes. Most people protected policy because policy protected employment. Walter reached into his coat pocket and placed an old photograph on the counter. The picture showed 3 men standing beside a collapsed grain silo in 1987. One of them was Walter 20 years younger. Another wore a Midstate maintenance jacket. Denise picked it up slowly. "That's my father," she said quietly. Walter nodded once. "Ray Harrow helped us after the tornado." Her expression shifted. "He passed in 2018. I heard." "Good man." Silence lingered between them. Finally Denise exhaled and stood. I can't release documents. But I can check whether a transfer batch exists. That's all we're asking. She disappeared through the aisles carrying a flashlight and clipboard. Ethan looked stunned. You knew her father? Walter shrugged slightly. Small counties remember disasters. 20 minutes later Denise returned holding a thin folder. There was a transfer batch from First National during the flood renovation, she admitted carefully. Mostly loan backups and compliance certifications. Walter felt his pulse rise. You still have them? Maybe. Maybe. She opened the folder and pointed toward a typed inventory sheet. Some boxes were reclaimed after renovations ended. Others weren't. Why not? Denise hesitated before answering. Water damage disputes. Insurance auditors flagged several shipments because the chain of custody forms didn't match. Ethan frowned. Meaning? Meaning certain records officially left the bank but were never officially signed back in. Walter's jaw tightened. Missing records. Not destroyed. Unaccounted for. Denise lowered her voice. There was legal pressure at the time. Bank executives wanted the issue closed fast. Walter stared at the inventory sheet. Several box numbers appeared beside department codes and transfer dates. Then he saw it. AG, Cert, 09-117. His restructuring compliance category. You still have this box? Walter asked. Denise checked again. According to the warehouse index, yes. Aisle 14. Ethan almost smiled. But Denise immediately raised a hand. I can confirm existence. Nothing more. Walter understood. Employees survived by avoiding liability. Still, existence changed everything. Denise led them through narrow aisles packed with aging boxes stacked nearly to the ceiling. The warehouse smelled like damp cardboard and machine oil. Finally she stopped beside shelf 14C. There. Walter looked upward. AG, Cert, 09-117. A faded white sticker clung to a dusty archive box. For several seconds nobody spoke. The proof had been sitting 30 miles away for over a decade. Unclaimed. Unreviewed. Forgotten by everyone except the inventory system. Ethan whispered, Grandpa. Walter stepped closer. What happens if records are improperly withheld before foreclosure proceedings? Denise crossed her arms uneasily. I'm not a lawyer. But you've seen this before. She hesitated. In large institutions, sometimes files disappear until someone important needs them. Walter nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to align in his mind. If the bank claimed no compliance certifications existed, then the foreclosure position strengthened dramatically. Penalties accumulated. Interest compounded. Land became vulnerable. And if old records later resurfaced? Most farmers lacked money to fight back by then. Denise checked the warehouse clock nervously. You need legal representation before touching anything. Walter looked at the sealed box again. For 12 years they told me I failed to comply. She didn't answer. Because silence sometimes admitted more than words. Back outside, snow flurries drifted across the parking lot as Ethan paced beside the truck. This is huge. Walter remained thoughtful. No. Huge is proving intent. You think they hid it on purpose? Walter stared toward the warehouse loading docks. I think corporations don't lose paperwork accidentally when millions of dollars sit behind the outcome. Ethan leaned against the truck. So what now? Walter took the inventory printout from his coat pocket. Now we find out who handled the transfer. That evening, Ethan searched old employee records online while Walter reviewed county hearing procedures at the kitchen table. Most reassessment disputes ended quietly because farmers settled before formal litigation. Few could afford extended legal fights against institutional attorneys. Then Ethan froze while scrolling through archived newspaper articles. Grandpa. Walter looked up. You remember a guy named Leonard Voss? Walter frowned faintly. Internal auditor. Worked for the bank years ago. Ethan turned the laptop screen around. A decade-old local article showed Leonard Voss resigning during a financial reporting controversy connected to document retention irregularities after the flood renovation. Walter read every line carefully. The article mentioned no criminal charges. No admissions. Just procedural discrepancies. But one sentence stood out. Former auditor declined comment regarding archived agricultural compliance certifications. Walter leaned back slowly. Agricultural compliance certifications. Not loan files. Not tax forms. Specifically compliance certifications. The exact records tied to Walter's dispute. Ethan stared at him. You think he knew? Walter folded the article quietly. I think somebody counted on rural people not digging this far. Outside, the farmhouse creaked beneath rising wind while darkness settled over the frozen fields. Somewhere beyond Mercer County, bankers prepared foreclosure schedules believing the Boone property remained vulnerable. But inside the old kitchen, a different possibility had begun taking shape. Not revenge. Not yet. Truth first. Then consequences. Walter looked again at the warehouse inventory number written on the paper beside his coffee mug. AG, Cert, 09-117. A forgotten archive box. And maybe the first crack in a story the bank had controlled for 12 years. 3 days later, Walter Boone sat inside a cramped legal office above a hardware store while attorney Claire Whitaker read through the warehouse inventory sheet for the second time. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Claire specialized in agricultural disputes, estate conflicts, and land access litigation across 3 rural counties. She wasn't famous, expensive, or particularly polished. But she had spent 15 years watching institutions overpower people who lacked the money to challenge paperwork. And unlike most attorneys Walter had spoken with recently, she hadn't interrupted him once. Finally she set the papers down. If these records exist, she said carefully, the bank has a problem. Ethan leaned forward immediately. A big problem? Claire ignored the excitement in his voice and focused on Walter instead. Maybe. But existence alone isn't enough. Walter nodded. Intent matters. Exactly. She folded her hands. Banks lose records all the time. Negligence is embarrassing, but not necessarily illegal. And deliberate concealment? That's different. The office fell quiet. Claire stood and walked toward a filing cabinet filled with county foreclosure cases. In reassessment disputes, she explained, the court mainly cares whether the lender acted in good faith during enforcement proceedings. If First National repeatedly claimed no compliance documentation existed while archived records remained accessible, she paused. That opens discovery. Ethan frowned. Discovery? The part where lawyers force institutions to produce internal communications, transfer records, audit notes, emails. Claire glanced toward Walter. Banks hate discovery. Walter understood why. Discovery meant people stopped controlling the narrative. Claire returned to her desk. The issue is timing. Your hearing is in 12 days. That enough? Not for a full injunction. She exhaled slowly. But maybe enough to delay proceedings if we establish reasonable evidence that material records were overlooked. Walter slid the newspaper article about Leonard Voss across the desk. Claire read it silently. Then her eyes narrowed slightly. Well, she said softly, that's interesting. You know him? Everybody in county finance knew him. Internal auditors rarely resign publicly unless pressure exists somewhere. Ethan leaned closer. Can we talk to him? Claire gave a humorless smile. If you can find him. According to public licensing records, Leonard Voss had left banking 2 years after the archive controversy. No updated address appeared under his name. No active accounting certifications remained. Disappeared. Or hidden. Claire tapped the newspaper article thoughtfully. If he documented transfer irregularities involving agricultural certifications, there might still be correspondence somewhere. Walter stared toward the snowy street outside. 12 years, he muttered. Claire looked at him carefully. "Mr. Boone, I need to ask something directly." He nodded. "Why didn't you fight harder back then?" Ethan looked uncomfortable, but Walter answered honestly. "Because after the drought, everybody was drowning." He rubbed his weathered hands together slowly. "When the bank says paperwork's missing, most farmers assume they made a mistake somewhere." Claire didn't respond immediately. She had heard versions of that sentence her entire career. Rural borrowers often trusted handshake reputations longer than they trusted legal instincts. Institutions understood that. "Okay," Claire said finally. "Here's what we do." She outlined the strategy carefully. First, she would petition the reassessment board for a temporary evidentiary review based on newly identified archived materials. That alone could delay immediate foreclosure recommendations. Second, they needed proof the bank either knew about the records or failed to conduct a competent search before asserting noncompliance. Third, and most important, they needed testimony from someone connected to the archive transfer process. Leonard Voss. Ethan sat up straighter. "So we track him down." Claire pointed at him. "Quietly." "Why quietly?" "Because if this escalates into institutional misconduct territory, First National will start protecting itself aggressively." Walter understood exactly what she meant. Banks didn't fear angry farmers. They feared documented liability. That afternoon, Ethan drove 2 counties west following old addresses tied to Leonard Voss while Claire prepared emergency filings. Walter remained at the farmhouse organizing every surviving document from the original loan restructuring. Boxes filled the kitchen table. Tax receipts. County correspondence. Insurance statements. Old compliance photocopies missing official confirmation stamps. Walter handled each paper carefully, remembering years when drought nearly erased the farm entirely. Back then the restructuring agreement had seemed like survival. Sandra Mitchell walked him through every certification requirement personally. She had been meticulous. Which was why Walter never believed the documents simply vanished. Near sunset, Ethan returned carrying a folded sheet of paper. "I found someone who knew Voss." Walter looked up. "Where?" "Retirement community near Ashford." Ethan removed his coat. An old accountant remembered him. "And? He's alive." Walter felt tension tighten in his chest. "Where?" Ethan hesitated. "South Dakota." Walter blinked once. South Dakota. Tiny town outside Pierre. Apparently he moved after the resignation. Walter sat quietly for several seconds. South Dakota might as well have been another world to people in Mercer County. Then Ethan handed him another paper. A phone number. Walter stared at it beneath the kitchen light. "You call." He didn't answer. Silence filled the room except for wind rattling loose siding outside. Finally Walter reached for the telephone mounted beside the refrigerator. He dialed slowly. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then a voice answered. "Yeah." Older. Guarded. Walter gripped the receiver tighter. "Leonard Voss." Long pause. "Who's asking?" "My name's Walter Boone." Silence again. Then the line almost disconnected before Walter spoke quickly. "You audited First National during the flood archive transfer." "Nothing. We found the storage inventory." A sharp inhale crossed the line. For several seconds neither man spoke. Finally Voss said quietly, "You shouldn't be calling me." Walter kept his voice calm. "You knew those certifications existed." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You resigned 2 months later." "That's not your business." Walter looked toward Ethan, who stood motionless nearby. 12 years they told me I failed compliance." Another silence. Then Voss spoke in a lower voice. "They weren't supposed to use those files like that." Walter felt the room tighten. "You saw it happen." "I saw enough." "Enough what?" But Voss ignored the question. "You need to understand something, Mr. Boone. People assume banks operate like local businesses." His voice carried bitterness now. "They don't. Once outside investors get involved, farms become numbers on a recovery spreadsheet. Walter's jaw hardened. Did they hide the records? The answer took several seconds. Finally Voss said quietly, I warned them the certifications couldn't disappear without exposure. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Exposure. Not mistake. Not oversight. Exposure. Who's them? Walter asked. But Voss immediately shifted tone. I shouldn't have answered this call. Leonard. You need a lawyer before contacting me again. The line went dead. Ethan stared across the kitchen. What did he mean? Walter slowly returned the receiver to its cradle. It wasn't a confession. Not legally. But it was close enough to change everything. Because now there was a witness. A frightened one. Which meant the truth buried inside AG, Cert. 09-117 might be far more dangerous than missing paperwork. Outside, darkness swallowed the Boone farm while snow covered the empty fields in silence. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, a former bank auditor had just confirmed the one thing Walter Boone needed most. The archive room had not forgotten him. Someone had chosen to. Claire Whitaker filed the emergency motion the next morning at 8:12 a.m. By noon, First National Agricultural Trust responded with a formal objection arguing that Walter Boone's claims relied on speculative archival inconsistencies unsupported by authenticated evidence. The filing arrived 17 pages long, packed with procedural language designed to overwhelm anyone without legal training. Claire expected that. What she did not expect was the speed. They were waiting, she said while reviewing the response inside her office. Walter sat across from her quietly. Ethan paced near the windows again, restless as always. Claire flipped another page. This wasn't drafted overnight. Their legal department already prepared for archive-related challenges. Walter narrowed his eyes slightly. Meaning they knew somebody might look. Or somebody already had. That possibility settled heavily across the room. Claire pointed toward a paragraph buried near the end of the filing. Here. Walter adjusted his glasses and read aloud slowly. The bank maintains that all relevant agricultural compliance materials were reviewed in accordance with standard internal retention procedures following the 2011 flood remediation transfer. Walter looked up. That sentence matters. Claire nodded immediately. Very much. Why? Because they're no longer claiming the records never existed. She tapped the paper. Now they're claiming they reviewed them. Ethan stopped pacing. So they changed the story. Exactly. Walter leaned back carefully. For 12 years the bank insisted no compliance certifications could be located. Now, after the warehouse inventory surfaced, the language shifted toward procedural review. That wasn't random. That was defensive repositioning. Claire continued reading silently before closing the folder. If we prove those records were never actually returned from mid-state storage, then this statement becomes dangerous for them. Walter understood. A corporation could survive lost paperwork. False representations in legal enforcement proceedings were another matter entirely. Claire stood and walked toward the coffee machine near the wall. You know what institutions fear most? She asked quietly. Ethan answered first. Lawsuits. No, she poured coffee slowly. Patterns. Walter looked up. Claire nodded toward him. One mistake in foreclosure is manageable. But if archived certifications disappeared repeatedly during agricultural restructurings after the flood, she let the sentence trail off. Ethan stared at her. You think other farmers got hit too? Claire handed Walter a coffee mug. I think banks don't spend this much energy suppressing isolated problems. Silence filled the office. Because they all understood what that meant. If Walter's records were intentionally sidelined to strengthen debt recovery positions, then Mercer County's economic decline might contain stories nobody ever questioned properly. And those stories could reach far beyond one farm. That afternoon, Claire secured a temporary evidentiary delay from the reassessment board pending archive verification. It wasn't a victory, but it bought time. Unfortunately, it also triggered attention. By evening, Walter noticed a black SUV parked twice along County Route 14 while returning from the feed supplier. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. At the farmhouse, Ethan checked the mailbox and found an overnight envelope from First National's legal department. Inside sat a settlement proposal. Claire reviewed it over speakerphone while Walter listened from the kitchen table. They're offering debt reduction, suspension of penalties, and voluntary land restructuring in exchange for immediate dismissal of all archive-related claims. Ethan laughed in disbelief. That fast? Walter remained expressionless. Claire's tone sharpened. Mr. Boone, listen carefully. Institutions settle quickly when litigation risk exceeds public exposure risk. Walter stared at the papers. The proposal would save most of the property. For many farmers, that alone would end the fight. But one sentence near the bottom caught his attention. Borrower agrees no material misconduct occurred during prior compliance review procedures. Walter read it twice. Then folded the papers calmly. They want protection. Claire answered immediately. Yes. Ethan leaned across the table. So reject it. Walter didn't respond immediately. At 72, survival and pride no longer felt interchangeable. He understood exactly how exhausting prolonged legal battles became. Even winning carried costs. Still, something about the settlement bothered him more deeply than the foreclosure itself. Not the money. The certainty. First National acted like exposure frightened them more than land recovery. That meant the archive box probably contained more than his certifications alone. Claire, Walter said finally, how do we get access to AG, Cert 09-117? Court order. How long? Depends how aggressively they resist. Walter looked toward the dark fields outside the kitchen window. His father used to say large companies preferred quiet endings because quiet endings prevented witnesses. After a long silence, Walter spoke again. Reject the offer. Ethan smiled slightly. Claire didn't. You understand what happens next? Walter nodded. They stopped negotiating. Exactly 24 hours later, First National filed another motion seeking dismissal of all evidentiary claims based on lack of authenticated archive access. And attached to the filing was a sworn affidavit. Signed by Daniel Hollis. Claire read it aloud during an emergency meeting the following morning. I personally supervised comprehensive review efforts related to Mr. Boone's compliance history and found no verified documentation establishing fulfillment of restructuring obligations. Walter's expression hardened. That's a lie. Claire nodded slowly. Potentially. Ethan pointed toward the affidavit. He said personally supervised. Which means, Claire replied carefully, if archived certifications surface later, his sworn statement becomes a serious issue. Walter stared at the document for several seconds. Then he remembered something. When I met Hollis, he said quietly, he mentioned Sandra Mitchell retiring. Claire looked up immediately. The former loan officer? Walter nodded. He brought her up before I did. Ethan frowned. Why's that matter? Walter leaned forward slowly. Because if the records truly vanished years ago, there'd be no reason for him to anticipate I'd mention her specifically. Claire's eyes narrowed. You think he reviewed the original certification chain? Walter nodded once. And knew whose signatures were supposed to be there. Silence settled heavily across the office. Claire immediately reached for her legal pad. We need Sandra Mitchell. Ethan blinked. You think she remembers paperwork from 12 years ago? Claire looked toward Walter. People forget forms. They don't forget cover-ups. By late afternoon, Ethan located Sandra Mitchell living in a small assisted living community outside Brookfield. Claire arranged a meeting for the next morning. That night Walter sat alone on the farmhouse porch wrapped in his winter coat while cold wind crossed the empty fields. The property looked peaceful beneath moonlight. But Mercer County itself felt different now. For years Walter believed he had simply lost against a stronger system. That belief carried shame, but also simplicity. Now simplicity was gone. Because the deeper they dug, the clearer one possibility became. First National Agricultural Trust had not merely pursued debt recovery. Someone inside the institution may have engineered it. Walter stared across the frozen land his father once fought to keep alive during recession years. Then headlights appeared at the end of the gravel road. A black SUV slowed briefly near the mailbox before continuing past the farmhouse without stopping. Walter watched until the lights disappeared. No threats. No confrontation. Just presence. A reminder that somebody else understood the stakes now too. Inside the house, Ethan opened the door. "You coming in?" Walter remained seated another moment. Then he spoke quietly into the cold night. "They're scared." Sandra Mitchell still wrote the letter S too wide. Walter noticed it immediately on the crossword puzzle resting beside her chair when Claire introduced them inside the assisted living lounge. Morning sunlight filtered softly through lace curtains while residents watched an old game show near the television. Sandra looked smaller than Walter remembered. Age had narrowed her shoulders and softened her voice, but her eyes remained sharp behind thick glasses. "Walter Boone," she said slowly. "Lord, that's a long time ago." Walter smiled faintly. "Feels longer." Claire explained the situation carefully without leading questions. She knew witness contamination could destroy credibility later if testimony became necessary. Sandra listened quietly. Then she frowned. "They said your certifications were missing." Walter nodded. "That can't be right." Claire leaned forward slightly. "Why not?" "Because after the Patterson dispute in 2010, I duplicated every agricultural compliance submission personally." Sandra tapped her fingers against the chair arm. "Every one." Ethan exchanged a glance with Walter. Claire kept her tone measured. "Where were those duplicates stored?" "Temporary flood archives first. Then returned to the bank basement after renovations." Sandra paused. "At least that was the plan." Walter studied her carefully. "What happened?" Sandra hesitated. For the first time since they arrived, uncertainty crossed her expression. "There was pressure," she admitted quietly. Claire immediately noticed the wording. "Pressure from who?" Sandra looked toward the television across the room as if searching through old memories. Regional management started reviewing distressed agricultural portfolios after the drought years. They wanted stronger recovery numbers before federal audits. She swallowed lightly. Loan restructurings complicated those numbers. Walter felt his jaw tighten. Claire spoke carefully. "Did anyone instruct you to remove certifications?" Sandra answered immediately. "No." Then she stopped. "But?" Sandra closed her eyes briefly. "There were meetings after the flood transfer. Certain files were labeled incomplete pending verification." She looked back at Walter. "Your name was mentioned." Ethan leaned forward. "By who?" Sandra shook her head slowly. "I don't remember everyone." But Walter suspected she did. Some memories remained dangerous even after retirement. Claire changed approach gently. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you remember Daniel Hollis?" Sandra's expression changed instantly. Not fear. Recognition. He was junior compliance counsel back then. Walter stared at Claire. Hollis had implied distance from the old records. But now another piece shifted. Claire remained calm. "Did Hollis participate in the archive reviews?" Sandra answered carefully. "He attended meetings regarding document recovery exposure." Exposure again. The same word Leonard Voss used. Walter felt cold anger settle slowly beneath his ribs. Not explosive anger. Worse. The quiet kind built from years of humiliation finally rearranging themselves into understanding. Sandra continued speaking softly. "After the renovations, several compliance files stayed flagged as unresolved longer than they should have." She looked directly at Walter now. "I questioned it once." Claire asked the obvious question. "What happened?" Sandra gave a tired smile. "They moved me to retirement transition 6 months later." Silence filled the lounge. An elderly man laughed at the television nearby while somewhere down the hallway a nurse pushed a medicine cart past family photographs. Ordinary life continuing beside buried history. Claire finally opened her notebook again. "Mrs. Mitchell, would you be willing to provide a sworn statement?" Sandra looked frightened for the first time. "At my age? It could matter enormously." Sandra stared down at her folded hands. "You need to understand something," she said quietly. "Banks in rural counties aren't just businesses. They sponsor schools, fund hospitals, finance churches. People protect them because communities depend on them." Walter nodded slowly. He knew. That was exactly why farmers rarely fought back publicly. Challenging the bank often meant challenging the town itself. Sandra looked toward him again. "I always wondered what happened to some of those families." Walter held her gaze. "Most lost quietly." Her eyes watered slightly. Then she whispered something almost too softly to hear. "I'm sorry." Walter didn't answer immediately. Because apologies could not return years taken by shame, debt, or fear. Still, he believed her remorse was genuine. And genuine remorse usually meant hidden truth somewhere underneath. Back in Claire's office that afternoon, they reviewed Sandra's preliminary statement alongside Leonard Voss's phone comments and the mid-state inventory logs. 3 separate points now aligned. The certifications existed. Internal personnel knew they existed. And management treated them as exposure risks. Claire leaned back slowly after organizing the papers. "This is no longer just about foreclosure." Ethan nodded. "It's fraud." Claire raised a hand carefully. "Maybe. Don't outrun the evidence." Walter appreciated that about her. She never dramatized facts before proving them. Still, even she looked unsettled now. If Hollis supervised archive reviews before becoming senior counsel, she continued, then his affidavit becomes incredibly dangerous if contradicted. Ethan frowned. Dangerous for him personally? For the bank institutionally? Walter stared toward the office window. "Which explains the settlement." Claire nodded once. At exactly 4:43 p.m., her office phone rang. She answered calmly. Then her expression hardened almost immediately. "Yes," she said coldly. "He's here." Long pause. "No, that won't happen." Another silence. Finally Claire hung up. Ethan looked alarmed. "Who was that?" "First National Legal." Walter watched her carefully. "What did they want?" Claire exhaled slowly. "They're increasing the settlement offer." Ethan laughed again in disbelief. But Claire did not smile. "How much?" Walter asked. "They'll clear the entire remaining debt balance." The room fell silent. Free and clear ownership. No foreclosure. No penalties. No reassessment. For most families, it would sound miraculous. But Claire's expression remained grim. "What's the condition?" Walter asked quietly. She slid the revised agreement across the desk. This time the language was broader. Borrower acknowledges no intentional misconduct occurred regarding archival handling, compliance review procedures, or institutional reporting practices. Walter read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Institutional reporting practices. They were protecting more than one case now. Claire folded her arms. "They're scared of discovery." Ethan stared at Walter excitedly. "Grandpa, this proves it." Walter remained quiet. Because another realization had arrived. If First National feared discovery enough to erase the debt entirely, then the archive box probably contained records tied to additional farms. Maybe dozens. And if those certifications resurfaced publicly, years of foreclosure actions across Mercer County could suddenly face scrutiny. Walter thought about abandoned fields. Auction signs. Farmhouses sitting empty beside overgrown roads. How many families had believed the same thing he believed? That missing paperwork meant personal failure. Claire interrupted his thoughts carefully. "You don't have to carry this into a larger fight." Walter looked at her. You think it's larger already? She didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Outside, evening rain replaced snow across Mercer County while courthouse lights flickered on downtown. Farmers finished feeding livestock. Families ate dinner. Local news discussed weather forecasts and school funding. Nobody yet understood what might be buried inside AG, Cert. 09-117. But Walter Boone understood one thing clearly now. The bank no longer viewed him as a powerless old farmer. They viewed him as a threat. And threats only mattered when truth had the potential to spread. Walter slowly pushed the settlement papers back across Claire's desk. Tell them no again. Ethan stared at him. Claire studied him carefully for several seconds before nodding once. All right. Walter stood and walked toward the office window overlooking Mercer County's fading evening streets. For years First National Agricultural Trust controlled the story. Now they were trying desperately to control the ending. And those were not the same thing. The court hearing began at 9 a.m. on a rainy Thursday beneath low gray clouds hanging over Mercer County Courthouse. Farmers in work jackets filled the rear benches beside local reporters, county clerks, and several First National employees pretending not to recognize one another. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. Not the details. Just the possibility. An old farmer challenging the bank. That alone drew attention. Walter Boone sat beside Claire Whitaker near the front while Ethan watched nervously from behind them. Across the aisle, Daniel Hollis reviewed documents with two corporate attorneys in tailored navy suits. He looked calm. Too calm. Claire leaned toward Walter quietly. They'll try limiting scope immediately. Stay patient. Walter nodded once. At exactly 9:14, the reassessment board entered. Chairman Harold Finch adjusted his glasses and reviewed preliminary motions before addressing the room. Counselors, he said formally, we are here regarding the Boone agricultural reassessment dispute and related evidentiary filings. One of the bank attorneys stood first. Mr. Chairman, First National Agricultural Trust maintains that the borrower's allegations rely upon speculative assumptions unsupported by authenticated documentation. Claire rose immediately afterward. We intend to establish reasonable grounds that material compliance records existed, were archived, and may have been improperly excluded from prior enforcement review procedures. The room became very quiet. Procedures. Carefully chosen language. Not accusations yet. But close enough. The bank attorney objected repeatedly during the first 20 minutes, arguing the archived materials remained inaccessible without formal authentication. Claire expected that too. Then she introduced Sandra Mitchell's sworn affidavit. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Daniel Hollis stopped writing. Claire read portions slowly into the record. I duplicated all agricultural compliance submissions following the Patterson dispute of 2010. Several files remained flagged unresolved longer than appropriate. Walter Boone's certifications were among records discussed during internal archive meetings. Murmurs spread across the courtroom benches. The bank attorney stood immediately. Objection. Speculative recollection. Claire didn't flinch. Mrs. Mitchell directly supervised agricultural compliance intake during the relevant period. Chairman Finch allowed the affidavit provisionally. Then Claire introduced the mid-state inventory logs confirming AG, Cert. 09-117 still existed within off-site storage. For the first time, Hollis looked genuinely uncomfortable. Walter noticed his right hand stop moving completely. Claire approached carefully now, building pressure piece by piece. Mr. Chairman, the institution previously represented that no compliance documentation could be located. Yet archived certification batches remained indexed and recoverable through third-party inventory systems. The bank attorney interrupted again. Archived existence does not establish content. Correct, Claire replied calmly. Which is precisely why discovery becomes necessary. There it was. Discovery. The word everyone in the room understood. Because discovery meant internal communications. Audit trails. Transfer records. Emails. Possibly years of them. The bank attorney requested recess immediately. Chairman Finch granted 15 minutes. As people stood and whispered throughout the courtroom, Ethan leaned toward Walter. They're rattled. Walter kept watching Hollis across the room. The banker spoke rapidly with legal counsel near the windows. His composure remained mostly intact, but something underneath had changed. Calculation. During recess, Claire received a folded note from a courthouse clerk. She read it silently. Then looked at Walter. You need to see this. The note contained a single sentence. Leonard Voss is here. Walter looked toward the back hallway doors. A thin older man stood partially hidden near the entrance, raincoat still wet from outside weather. Leonard Voss. He looked exhausted. And terrified. Claire approached him privately while Walter remained seated. Several tense minutes passed before she returned. Well? Ethan whispered. Claire lowered her voice carefully. He brought copies. Walter stared at her. Copies of what? Internal audit memorandums. Everything inside Walter suddenly became still. Claire continued quietly. Voss documented concerns during the flood archive reconciliation. Specifically agricultural restructuring certifications categorized as unresolved exposure files. Exposure files. Not lost. Categorized. Intentional language. The hearing resumed 20 minutes later. Claire requested permission to supplement the evidentiary motion with newly presented audit materials. The bank objected furiously, but Chairman Finch reviewed the preliminary memorandum personally before speaking again. His expression darkened noticeably. Counsel, he said slowly toward the bank attorneys, this document references unresolved certification inventories connected to active agricultural enforcement actions. Nobody answered immediately. Then Claire delivered the final pressure point. We additionally note, she said calmly, that Mr. Hollis submitted sworn representations asserting comprehensive review despite apparently participating in unresolved archive discussions during the relevant remediation period. All eyes turned toward Daniel Hollis. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at Walter Boone. Not dismissively. Not confidently. Like a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted. The chairman removed his glasses slowly. In light of these developments, he announced, this board is suspending reassessment enforcement pending formal judicial review and potential discovery proceedings. The room erupted into whispers. Ethan exhaled sharply beside Walter. But Claire remained focused. Because this was not victory yet. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel Hollis stood voluntarily. His own attorneys looked stunned. Mr. Chairman, he said carefully, First National Agricultural Trust requests private conference regarding immediate settlement parameters. Claire didn't move. Chairman Finch frowned. You may discuss settlement outside proceedings. Hollis swallowed once before continuing. The bank additionally agrees to release all remaining claims against the Boone property effective immediately. The courtroom became completely silent. Walter understood what everyone else did too. The bank wanted the case buried before discovery opened wider. Claire looked toward Walter carefully. His decision. Always his decision. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he stood slowly beneath the old courtroom lights. Rain tapped softly against courthouse windows while generations of Mercer County history seemed to settle quietly across the room. Walter looked first at Hollis. Then toward the gathered farmers watching from the benches. Men and women who spent years believing paperwork failures always belonged to them. Finally Walter spoke. I'll accept release of the property. Relief flashed briefly across the bank attorneys' faces. Then Walter continued. But the archive records go public. Silence again. Absolute silence. Hollis stared at him. Claire remained perfectly still beside the table. Walter's voice stayed calm. You told people they had nothing. He looked directly at Hollis now. Turns out you just buried where the truth was kept. Nobody moved. Not reporters. Not attorneys. Not even Ethan. Because everyone understood the sentence carried far beyond one farm. The chairman cleared his throat quietly. Mr. Boone, are you formally requesting preservation of archival materials for further review? Walter nodded once. Yes. Across the room, Daniel Hollis lowered his eyes for the first time since this began. Not defeated exactly, but exposed. And exposure changes power faster than anger ever can. Outside the courthouse, rain fell steadily across Mercer County while reporters gathered near the courthouse steps. Farmers stood beneath umbrellas whispering to one another about missing certifications, old foreclosures, and records nobody had questioned before now. Walter ignored the cameras. He walked slowly toward his truck with Ethan beside him. You really think more families were affected? Ethan asked quietly. Walter looked toward the distant fields beyond town. I think people stop asking questions when institutions teach them shame first. Ethan nodded silently. Before climbing into the truck, Walter glanced back once at the courthouse entrance where First National attorneys hurried toward waiting vehicles. For 12 years the bank controlled the narrative. A struggling farmer. Missing paperwork. Nothing to prove. But hidden deep inside an off-site archive box, forgotten beneath dust and flood inventory numbers, the truth waited longer than the lies did. And in the end, that made all the difference.